Our first speaker is Ed Marx, AICP, the Tompkins County Commissioner of Planning and Community Sustainability. As the chair of the county legislature, I'm really proud that that's Ed's title. Ed oversees development and implementation of the Tompkins County Comprehensive Plan. This includes many, many efforts to increase countywide energy efficiency and accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy, while building partnerships among local governments, business leaders, colleges and universities, nonprofit organizations, and counties across our region. So welcome, Ed. Come on up. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you, everyone, for coming out today. Just last Monday, on the holiday, I happened to be taking a little road trip in Ithaca County, Pennsylvania. Hadn't been there in probably 20 years. Was going to the Grand Canyon of Pennsylvania, Pine Creek. Many of you probably have been there. I don't know if you haven't. I'd recommend it. And I kind of remembered that as kind of a rural community, much like the small towns around here. And once you got off the interstate and headed on, I think it's State Route 6, towards Wellsboro, all of a sudden the character of the area changed dramatically. On the left-hand side was a huge earth-moving operation going on. A whole field completely torn up and big machinery moving earth around. I don't know what it was. I'm surmising it had something to do with the topic we're talking about today, because right after that, the road was lined on both sides with gas well field service companies, construction companies, trucking terminals, that I'm sure hadn't been there the last time I was there 20 years ago. As you drove into the village of Wellsboro, one traffic light in town, every cycle there were 3 or 4, 5 big trucks lined up hauling water or something, somewhere. And every other vehicle seemed to be a pickup truck with the name of some company, and I'm sure hadn't been in that community 10 years ago. Driving out of the village towards the state park, all of a sudden there was a big swath of brown excavated dirt going as far as you could see across the landscape with pipeline sitting next to it. And throughout, you felt there was dust in the air. I mean, you could smell it, you could feel it. The environment had been changed. And so when we talk about cumulative impacts and considerations for local government, these are exactly the things we're talking about. We're talking about a fundamental change in communities. And whether it's for the good or not, I guess it's up to each individual to decide. But I don't think there's any doubt that we're talking about fundamental change in rural communities. So the SGEIS, the Tompkins County Planning Department, is really just digging into it right now. We did a thorough review the first time around. We've begun looking at the changes, and so much of what I'm going to have to say is going to be focused on a couple of issues, and it will be somewhat limited in scope at this point. We'll be doing more, and we will have full comments posted on our website later on, and I'll give you that so you can check in about a month or so when we will have completed our review and have all the detailed recommendations that we see that still comments that need to be made. A couple changes from the first version. This is a somewhat subtle change, but it may or may not end up being significant. In this version, the DEC says that it will require the applicant to state that they have checked all local comprehensive plans and zoning if they're in compliance, and if they're not, to say that their proposed activity would not be in compliance. But it also says now that the local government, if local government informs DEC that the proposed permit would not be in compliance with local plans or regulations, that the DEC will need to consider whether that means there are significant adverse impacts that need to be addressed. Now, it's not real clear what DEC will do with that information if it's submitted to them, but it certainly is a little bit more of an opening for influence from local communities than was in the first version. And in some ways, I think that's very good, but it also puts added pressure on municipalities to be prepared for this activity so that they aren't left out of that potential discussion. Related to that, previously the DEC said that it would notify a local municipality the first time a permit was issued or was applied for in its jurisdiction, and after that it was up to the local municipality to keep track of what was going on. Well, they got a lot of comments on that apparently, because now it says they will notify local governments of all applications, which is an improvement. And they will have an electronic notification system, they say, that will automatically do that. So there is a little more chance, a little more opportunity for local governments to get engaged. However, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, most local municipalities have very limited staff, if any, that are full-time. And so their ability to respond, there's no indication here that I've seen yet in my review of time frame for this response. And so I think that's something we will definitely want to comment on and make sure that if there's going to be a notification to local government, they have a meaningful window of opportunity to provide whatever comment back that may be warranted based on their local plans. Several communities in this county, as you all know, I think, have determined that their local plans state that gas drilling is not compatible with their plan, period. So what DEC will do with that, I do not know. The other thing, and this is not a change, but just this is about the only other thing that the SGEIS says about local governments, really, and their influence in this process, is about road use agreements. And there's been a lot of activity in this community on that issue. The language hasn't really changed much in the SGEIS as far as I can tell. They're still saying they recommend that municipalities, that applicants have road use agreements with municipalities. They are going to ask for a transportation plan. Interestingly, again from the observation in Pennsylvania, these trucks are coming from locations, not coming from the well drilling site to get water and back. They're actually starting from a location somewhere in a community. So those trips are going to go from there through wherever they have to go through on state roads, through little villages and big cities probably, to get to their destinations. And so location of those trucking facilities is going to become, I think, a key issue, one which will be totally under the control of local government, because that's not an activity regulated by DEC to my knowledge. But the necessity to have something in place to assure a meaningful road use agreement in your municipality remains, and that's one that I think municipalities are working on, but it is still a complicated, difficult, and costly process for them to be going through. So some of the cumulative impacts, they heard a little bit, the DEC, of the message on that, but not enough. But some things that really weren't analyzed at all last time at least are getting some discussion. One was habitat fragmentation for grasslands and forests that's now addressed in a way that's not terribly effective, but at least it's an initial acknowledgement of that issue. It looks at certain areas of major concentration of grassland and forest, contiguous areas, and says that within those areas there's some standards that will be applied. However, in this county, that leaves out forested areas identified for protection in the state open space plan. In fact, the SGEIS, to my knowledge, never mentions the fact that there's a state open space plan and the impacts of drilling on that. It also does not include under grasslands, Audubon Society and New York State designated important bird area, grassland habitat, not included in the areas where they're going to apply criteria for protection of grassland birds. So there's obviously some key gaps there that need to be addressed. Greenhouse gas emissions, they are requiring a little bit more than what's in the first draft, but they have not taken our suggestion to do a real cumulative analysis, and there's still no sense of whether this activity will allow the state to comply with its other goal of 80% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This process of drilling for gas is projected to peak in 30 years. Well, 30 years from now is 10 years from when we need to meet a 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions on a statewide basis per state policy. But there's no reconciliation of those two issues that I've been able to find anywhere. Socioeconomic impacts, there's quite an effort to show the purported benefits of this in quite a bit of analysis of tax revenues and employment and things of that nature. Not much on the countervailing impacts on local governments and other aspects of our socioeconomic situation. Not addressed, I guess I would say I haven't seen one yet that's been adequately addressed, so that slide is probably, those slides probably should say the same thing, but the DEC continues to say that the Public Service Commission is responsible for permitting pipelines, and so they aren't looking at that. But as I mentioned, that was the biggest scar on the landscape I saw going through a gas drilling area in Pennsylvania. And it's a permanent scar because it's go right up and over hills and down through valleys, and those right-of-ways are going to remain cleared. And so those are permanent, and we know they will come with this, and yet there's no acknowledgement that that's an activity that's part of this, should be part of this SGEIS. Industrialization of rural areas, as I observed, and we know we can expect, there will be pressure not only for the things I mentioned, but for additional gravel mining. We know that's been an issue. All types of activities that are needed to support this massive industrial activity on the landscape are not really addressed at all in the SGEIS. And the traffic impacts are addressed in a way that doesn't really reflect their cumulative impact on communities. The overall increase, what happens at, let's just suggest, some of these, what happens on Route 13 in Ithaca if you have a convoy of 10, 20 trucks coming through from one location to another every 20 minutes all day long. That's what you might expect if drilling were happening here. Wherever it happens, those localized impacts are going to be there, and they just don't seem to be addressed adequately. Doesn't really address local government's needs hardly at all. We all know there will be lots of impacts. Public safety is mentioned a little bit, but there's no, it's just an assumption you're going to get tax revenues and that should take care of it. That's what it seems like anyway. And perhaps most important for communities is the boom and bust cycle. The socioeconomic impact analysis shows population ups and downs. It shows employment. It shows tax revenues on this kind of 30 years growing, 30 years declining. But certain things kind of drop off a cliff. When you get to the point where most of the drilling has occurred, employment in one-to-one scenario went from, on a regional basis, 42,000 to 13,000 in a year on this little chart. And yet there's no real discussion of the boom and bust impact. And then locally, that boom and bust is likely to happen on shorter cycles because the 30 years is for the whole state. But probably activity is going to occur more intensively in certain geographic areas on shorter periods of time. And so we can expect perhaps 10-year cycles of big increases in activities and then things falling off. And that's not fitting with our definition here in Tompkins County of a sustainable economy. So those are some of the initial big picture things. We're going to be digging into those quite a bit more. We have been working for the last year with the Tompkins County Council of Governments to help identify how local governments can be better prepared for this. And we're about to send out a letter to local municipal officials, and they may or may not like getting this letter, but we said we got some grant funds to do that from our friends at the Park Foundation, so we need to send it. But this is the list of things that you need to look at as a local government in order to be prepared for the possible impacts. First of all, your comprehensive plan, as I mentioned, that is referenced in the SGEIS, and if you don't have one, then they can check that off. You don't have to worry about that. Zoning, if whether or not it will control anything to do with the well pads themselves, all of these ancillary activities that may in some cases have even greater impacts than the drill pads and longer term impacts can only be addressed by local zoning in most cases, or site plan regulation, special permit. And the list goes on. So there's a lot of things many local governments are starting to look at, but there's really no assistance for local governments to deal with this, which is something maybe the state needs to think about. I know when Fort Drum was developed and expanded, there was a considerable assistance to local municipalities through the Tug Hill Commission to deal with the impacts of that expansion on those communities. Even though that was viewed as a positive economic thing, there was still recognition there would be housing impacts, and there would be transportation impacts, and there would be other impacts of that. And there was a considerable effort to help communities deal with that. There seems to be really nothing happening along those lines for communities right now, and it needs to. So just in conclusion, we expect to complete our review of the SGEIS in mid-November. We will post our comments on our website, tompkins-co.org/planning, and we'll hopefully get them up there by then so that they'll be available for people to use as they write their own comments before the deadline. I think there's a lot to be thinking about, and unfortunately some of what we need to be thinking about isn't really even hardly contained within the SGEIS, and yet it will come with the permitting process once that begins. So we'll be working with local municipalities as best we can, but everybody's resources are shrinking, demands are increasing, and this just is another huge thing on the table of local governments that are already stressed to deal with what they have to deal with right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. Speaking of traffic, I happened to be reading the memo that was written by the New York State DOT, and their language about truck traffic is really quite something. To quote, "The potential transportation impacts are ominous. Assuming current gas drilling technology and a lower level of development than will be experienced in Pennsylvania, the Marcellus region will see a peak year increase of up to 1.5 million heavy truck trips, and induced development may increase peak hour trips by 36,000 trips per hour." And as Ed said, I mean, they're talking about the region, but we know this will be done specifically in a few counties at first, and then broaden out. So take that 36,000 trips per hour and divide it by, say, 3, which is the 3 counties that are in the sweet spot. The annual cost to undertake these transportation projects are estimated to range from $90 million to $156 million for state roads, and from $121 to $222 million for local roads. There's no mechanism in place allowing state and local governments to absorb these costs. So that's even the State Department of Transportation saying that.